Good evening. It's very good to be able to talk to you today. I'm sitting in Kew in West London, not very far from the famous gardens, and we have, very appropriately for tonight's talk, Mediterranean weather of the type that you would probably expect in Greece at about this time of year. And of course, tonight too, we're on the eve of the next round of the Olympic Games in Tokyo, and I'll refer to them later on. My name is David Durie. I spent most of my life working for the British government at home and overseas, including as British Deputy Ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, and finally as Governor and Commander-in-Chief of Gibraltar, which is a British overseas territory at the western end of the Mediterranean. While I was there, I was lucky enough to be knighted, so I now have the style Sir David Durie. In recent years, I've enjoyed being a guest enrichment lecturer on many Viking Ocean ships, starting with Viking Star on its first autumn in 2015 in the Mediterranean. And I think of myself mainly as a storyteller, not as a historian. I like to try and tell guests about something they probably know a bit about already, but would like to know more. Today's talk is about the Olympic Games, ancient and modern, is one such example. If you go on a Viking ocean cruise to Greece, which calls at the small port of Katakolon in the Peloponnese, you will be able to visit Olympia, which is where the Olympic Games was founded as long ago as 776 BC. To get to Olympia from the ship, you pass through peaceful and rural Greek countryside, which has probably hardly changed, except for the roads, since the time of the ancient Olympiad, all those years ago. Now, at the end of the talk, you'll be able to ask questions, and I will try and do my best to answer them. Now, here's my first slide, which represents both the ancient and the modern Olympic Games, with the modern five Olympic rings representing the 5 inhabited continents, all of which send athletes to the Games. But I'm going to start my talk with the original ancient Games. Amazingly, the site of the ancient Greek Olympic Games, which was founded, as I said, in 776 BC, and which was excavated in the 19th century, is still visible at Olympia. The site was lost for many centuries, overwhelmed by floods and earthquakes, until it was excavated. And happily, there is enough left to form a very good view of what actually took place there. And in this slide, you will see my wife standing at the finish line of the original sprint race. Behind her, we can see the original layout of the track and the embankment of the spectators' stadium. So today, I'm going to tell the story of the ancient Olympic Games, their refounding into the modern Olympic Games in 1896, and how the modern Games developed, before saying a few final words about my own experience as a volunteer at what many say was the best Olympic Games ever, London 2012. And indeed, I'm wearing the shirt of my volunteer's uniform. You can't see all that much of it, but this was the uniform which I proudly wore through the fortnight of the Olympics. The Games were Greek in origin, and participation was confined to Greeks from Greek city-states, from mainland Greece itself and across the Mediterranean. Each dot on this map represents a Greek city, and they stretch from Sicily in the west, including the famous Greek city of Syracuse, to modern-day Turkey in the east, as well, of course, as mainland Greece itself. The Olympic Games were run and controlled by a city-state called Elis in the Peloponnese at the southern end of the Greek mainland. And if your screen is big enough, you will see Elis just above the pointer of the arrow. That was the home of the Games. Only men were allowed to participate. The Olympic Games was in fact only one of a number of similar games across Greece, but they were by far the most important. Although the games almost certainly started before 776 BC, that date is generally counted as the date of the first Olympiad. Thereafter, they were held at 4-year intervals until 393 AD, so for well over 1,000 years. And they became absolutely central to the cultural life of ancient Greece, indeed to such an extent that the Greek dating system was defined by the Olympic Games cycle. So, for example, the year of the date of the Battle of Marathon, which was between Athens and its Greek allies against the Persians, which we date to 490 BC or BCE, was for the Greeks year 3 of the 72nd Olympiad. It really is impossible to overemphasize the importance of the games to Greek life. Prior to each games, every 4 years, a sacred truce was declared across Greece. Remember that Greek city-states were often at war with one another, which could have made participation in the games difficult, dangerous, or even impossible. So the host state, Elis, sent out heralds in the months before the games to declare a truce, and this in effect put athletes and spectators alike under the protection of the gods, allowing them to assemble at Olympia without hindrance. And this truce was almost invariably observed, and any state which breached it was heavily fined. It's not at all clear why Olympia was chosen as the venue. Being Greece, of course, there are various myths to explain both the origin and the site of the games, and two leading stories, which are very different from each other, are as follows. The first is that the king of the area, which was known as Pisa, not the Pisa in Italy, which we know today, he was called King Oenomaus, and he'd been warned that he would be killed by whoever married his extremely beautiful daughter, Hippodamia. And he insisted that the suitor could only marry Hippodamia if he beat the king in a chariot race, but that if the suitor lost, he in turn would be killed. Sure enough, at least a dozen suitors turned up one after the other, lost, and were duly dispatched, before a prince named Pelops came along and beat the king by trickery, ensuring that a wheel came off the king's chariot, dragging him to his death. So Pelops won the race, married Hippodamia, and became king, and the area of the Peloponnese in Greece is named after him, and he founded the games at Olympia in gratitude. So that's one story. The other story could not be more different, and that is that Heracles, or Hercules, founded the games at Olympia and building a temple to Zeus on the site to mark his success at cleaning the nearby Augean stables. You may remember that one of the 12 labours of Hercules was to clean the Augean stables within the space of 1 day. And these were stables where King Augeas kept 3,000 cattle which had not been cleaned for 30 years. So you can just imagine the filth. And Hercules succeeded in cleaning the stables by diverting a couple of nearby rivers to run through the stables and flush out the muck. And you can see that in this picture, the river going into the stables and the dirt flowing out from the other side, and Hercules looking on. And he founded the games at Olympia to mark his success. So those are the two of the myths. The real reason is undoubtedly much more prosaic. It's probably the case that the city-state of Elis, which controlled the games, was not seen as a threat to any of the major city-states of Greece, and the chosen site was relatively easily accessible, both by land and by sea. And the games, which lasted 5 days, started and finished with religious ceremonies at the temple of Zeus, which included the roasting of 100 sacrificial oxen at the great altar of Zeus on the third day of the games. And the actual games were preceded by a march by competitors and officials from Elis to Olympia along what was known as the Sacred Way. So in many ways, the Olympic festivals were as much religious as athletic events, and certainly until the 5th century BC, the winners always thanked Zeus for their victories. The site of the games at Olympia was known as the Altis, and it was crowded with buildings, some religious and some temporal, as can be seen by this plan drawn in the 1909 Baedeker Guide. The athletes all had to register and to train at Olympia for 1 month before the start of the games, and to assure the officials that they had been in training for at least 6 months beforehand. Anyone who could not prove that they were Greek or who appeared not to be sufficiently fit could be disqualified, and usually were, from taking part. There are curious echoes, I think, in all of that, of today's lockdown and quarantine periods with COVID. Incidentally, by the time that the Roman Empire took control of Greece in the 2nd century BC, Roman citizens were treated as honorary Greeks and allowed to participate. Now I want to move on to look at the detail of the site using a model which is on display at the British Museum in London. And the most important building on the site was the Temple of Zeus, and its ruins can be seen today. It contained an enormous statue of the god Zeus, which was constructed in the 5th century BC and later taken to Constantinople, where it was destroyed in a fire. So this is a thoroughly imaginary picture of what the statue would have looked like. What we do know, though, is that the size of it, 43 feet high, must have been absolutely enormous. Now let's look at the site in more detail, again using the British Museum model. First of all, you see the Temple of Zeus, which has been circled. Then the stadium or running track, which we saw earlier, which is just behind the Temple of Zeus. An area called the Palaistra, which was a training area for the boxing and wrestling that took place in the games. Another larger training area called the Gymnasium for all other sports. And quite importantly, this strange building here called the Leonidaion, which was a guest house for officials and visiting VIPs. And you see again, we will see echoes of that when we look at the modern games. And here's a close-up of the model, showing in the foreground the Temple of Zeus, and behind it the temple of the goddess Hera, used for the separate games of Hera for women. And here again is another close-up showing the relation of the Altis to the stadium or running track. There's a tunnel which exists even today, which runs from the Altis to the beginning of the running track. The stadium, which was 600 Greek feet long, about 200 yards in length, had raised embankments on either side for spectators, and it could hold up to 40,000, as well as an area for judges circled here. And the spectators were almost all men. Unmarried maidens, but not married women, were also allowed, which, if you think about it, is rather strange, because all the male athletes were entirely naked. So why unmarried women were allowed this privilege, whereas married women weren't, I cannot tell. Much of what we know about the sports that were part of the games is taken from illustrations of Greek vases, as the following slides will show, both in preparation for the games to compete and to clean up afterwards. The athletes oiled their bodies with olive oil, and scraped off any dirt and the surplus oil with a tool called a strigil, which you can see on the left-hand side of the bowl, a rather curious shaped tool. And there is an actual one which is in the British Museum. You can just imagine the athletes scraping their skin and taking off the oil and dirt with that. And that's what's happening in this picture. Running events took place on the third day of the games, and there were 4 of them. The short sprint, i.e. about 200 yards, one length of the stadium, then 2 lengths, 400 yards or 400 meters, then a longer race of about 20 to 24 lengths of the stadium, some 2 to 3 miles or 4 to 5 kilometers. And from the 65th Olympiad, i.e. 520 BC, these races were supplemented by a 400-meter, i.e. double length of the stadium, run with the athletes wearing armour, or supposedly wearing armour. But if you look at the pictures on this bowl, the armour seems to consist of a shield and a helmet, and not much, if anything, else. The official reward for the winner was an olive or palm or laurel wreath placed on the winner's head, and a ribbon with some kind of medal, not unlike the medal ceremony in the modern Olympics. But only the winner was recognised. There was nothing for those who came second or third. So the only official prize was the medal. There was nothing else. But the adulation which the winners received was extraordinary. They were treated as heroes by their home city states. They had, after all, brought great prestige on their home state, which often rewarded them with money and other prizes. At Olympia, the only recognition was a plinth, often installed and paid for by the winning athlete himself. Winners of multiple events, or of the same event in successive games, were especially revered and rewarded, and they were called heroes, somewhere between human and divine. And there are many examples of outstanding athletes in different disciplines. Perhaps the most outstanding of them all was one Leonidas of Rhodes, who won both the short sprints and the armoured running race in 4 successive Olympics between 164 and 152 BC. That's a feat, I think, which can fairly be compared to that of Usain Bolt in our own day, a triple gold medal in 3 successive Olympics from 2008 to 2016, again a sprinter. Usain Bolt, of course, is also a world record holder. There were no such things in the ancient Olympics, but the Greeks simply did not possess accurate timing devices. In addition to running, the pentathlon was introduced in the 18th Olympiad, 708 BC, which consisted of 5 disciplines. Throwing the discus, very like discus throwing today, this lovely statue of a discus thrower. And then the javelin, again, not unlike the javelin of today. This is shown on the inside of a plate. And then in some ways, I think my favourite event, I've gone slightly too far, my favourite event, which is the long jump. Long jump was unlike today's long jump. It was a standing jump, but the athlete had hand weights, which are shown at the bottom of this picture, and they're made of lead. And what the athlete would do is he would hold the weights behind him, and when he wanted to jump, he would thrust the weights forward and jump, and this would give him the impetus he needed to go a good distance. And what we see in this diagram, or in this bowl, is a judge looking at where an athlete is about to land so they can measure how good he has been at jumping. Then the 4th discipline in the pentathlon is wrestling. And again, you've got two naked athletes wrestling away with a judge on the right-hand side, making sure that all is fair. And that was the fourth discipline in the pentathlon. And the fifth, of course, was running. Now we move on to what were called the heavy sports. And on the left of this picture, we see two people boxing. Boxing was a particularly brutal sport, not unlike prize fighting in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were no gloves, no timed rounds, and the fight continued until one man was beaten. And in the bowl on the left, you can see blood spurting from the nose of the fighter on the left. And then we've also got this really remarkable bronze of what I call a well-fought man, broken nose, cauliflower ears, etc., and apparently blood spattered too. And I particularly like this statue, which I think is so evocative of what it must have been like for the competitors. The other of the so-called heavy sports was pancration, or all-in wrestling. Contestants had to adhere to strict rules, not allowed to gouge out the eye of your opponent, for example. And on this urn, the kneeling figure is submitting by putting his finger in the air, and the man on the right is signaling to the judge on the left to end the fight. It really is I think, beautiful depiction of the event, and shows very well what must have been going on. More generally, it's worth noting that rather like today's athletic circuit, the more prominent contestants in all sports went from games to games, and that some were in effect more or less full-time professionals. The equestrian events were introduced gradually as the games developed. They took place on a much longer and larger track, somewhere to the right of the stadium running track as we look at it from the Altis. And the races covered several laps of this track. Unfortunately, no trace of that track has ever been uncovered. Olympia, as I said earlier, suffered badly from both earthquakes and floods, and the equestrian track has either been washed away or covered in silt, or both. There were two kinds of chariot race as well as horse racing itself. And here is a bowl, an urn showing a 4-horse chariot racer approaching a turning point, a turning post in the thing. The white post on the right is a turning post. The Olympic chariot races were probably like the chariot race in the film Ben-Hur, which some of you may remember if you're young enough. The races were tough, dangerous affairs with plenty of thrills, spills and accidents, and very exciting for the spectators, perhaps a bit like IndyCar racing or Formula One today. And huge prestige went to the owners of the winning chariot, not to the charioteers, who were often slaves and who were therefore the ones to suffer in accidents. And this depiction of a 4-horse chariot in full flow approaching a turning point, you will note that the charioteer himself is clothed, unlike the other athletes. He's not naked. This would perhaps have given some protection in the case of accidents. The rule against women participating was broken by a Spartan princess called Cyniska, who entered her own 4-horse chariot, which won in both 396 and 392 BC, the 96th and 97th Olympiads. Because she was a woman, She was not even allowed to witness the race, but she did pick up the winner's laurels, and she had a bronze plaque made, put up to commemorate her achievement, and this is it, to which she added a boastful inscription: "I declare myself to be the only woman in Greece to have won this crown," which was true at the time, but in fact 3 other women are known to have won chariot races at later games. The ancient games continued until 393 AD, though they had gradually lost their luster over the years, and the final blow came when the Emperor Theodosius, a Christian, outlawed pagan practices across the empire. Remember that from the outset the games were religious in nature, dedicated to Zeus. In the years that followed, the site was abandoned and was beset by earthquakes and floods, which left the remains buried under several feet of silt. And it was not until 1875 that a team of German archaeologists began to uncover the site and to reveal it as we know it today. And we're looking here at part of the remains of the Temple of Zeus, and you can get some idea of the massive size of it, and of course of the earthquakes which knocked it down. In addition to what we see here, there is a reconstruction of the pediment, that's to say the triangular arch at the end of the Temple of Zeus, in the museum at Olympia, which contains original sculptures which appeared on the pediment, and so you get a good idea of what it actually looked like, and indeed of the size of it. And this figure in the foreground is tiny by comparison with the tallest of the statues. And so I'm going to move on now to the modern Olympic Games. I'm only going to talk about the Summer Games, which are closest equivalent to the original Games. The exhibitions excited a lot of interest and imagination, and one man in particular, a Frenchman, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, mounted a successful campaign to replicate the Games. I do like these 19th century photographs. He looks more like a 19th century librarian rather than the founder of the modern Olympics. With some difficulty, he persuaded the Greek government to back the idea, and he succeeded in getting them to build a stadium in Athens in which to hold the Games, and that is the stadium today. In fact, it's on the site of the original stadium for the ancient Panathenaic Games, not the ancient Olympic Games, which coexisted with the Olympic Games. And it's still there today. And you can see it if you ever visit Athens. It's well worth looking at. It's quite impressive. But its track is rather narrower and with tighter bends than modern athletic tracks. So it's not much used nowadays for athletics. The first Olympic Games of the modern era opened in Athens on the 6th of April, 1896, opened by King George I of Greece. It was a men-only affair like the ancient Games, though happily, or unhappily, happily, I think, the athletes were clothed. It was fairly modest in scale, as these figures show, and it was very strictly amateur. De Coubertin imagined wrongly that this had also been the case with the ancient Games. The modern Games were only open to professional athletes in the 1980s. As you will see, the small number of participants, most of them were Greek, and not surprisingly, they won most medals, but the USA won the most gold medals. I always find the strangest event of the early Games rope climbing, though I think it was a popular sport, particularly in America at the time. And you see this figure, he's not actually climbing the pole, he's pulling himself up on a rope to take himself to the top of the pole, and no doubt being judged as whether he's doing it properly or not. The event, however, which really caught the imagination in the 1896 Games was the first marathon race, supposedly representing the run by a messenger from Athens, reporting the Athenian success against the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC, as I mentioned. Although there is no evidence of such a run at the time, the idea caught on, and the first Olympic marathon, covering about 25 miles, was staged from the town of Marathon to Athens. Happily for everyone, the race was won by a Greek farmer, Louis Spiros, in a time of just under 3 hours, which actually I think is very impressive if you consider people had never run distances of this sort before in modern times. And he became a national hero, just as outstanding winners in the ancient games had become heroes in their states. After the 1896 Games, de Coubertin resisted Greek pressure to hold all subsequent games in Athens and established them on a 4-year cycle, like the ancient games, but to be held in different countries across the world. The games took a while to become fully established, but gradually increased in participation and prestige. And I'm now going to jump forward to the 1908 Games, which established the precise distance of the marathon at 26 miles, 365 yards, or 42.195 kilometers. The race was from Windsor Castle, west of London, to the Olympic Stadium in West London. The start line was altered so that the King and the Queen should get a good view of it, and the finish line was also changed so that spectators in the stadium could get a good view of the finish, and hence the precise but rather idiosyncratic length of the marathon, which persists even today. The other thing for which this race was famous is the fact that the first man across the finish line, an Italian called Dorando Pietri, who entered the stadium well ahead of the other competitors, collapsed 4 times before reaching the finish, and he was helped to his feet by officials who also assisted him across the line. Unfortunately for him, as a result of a protest by the American delegation on behalf of the American who came second, Pietri was disqualified. He was, however, presented with a silver cup by Queen Alexandra instead. De Coubertin went on to adopt a number of mottos and symbols for the games, and the famous 5-ring symbol, which we saw at the start, which represents the 5 inhabited continents, and the motto, in Latin of course, for Greek games, Citius Altius Fortius, which means faster, higher, stronger. And de Coubertin also picked up a statement first voiced by the American Bishop of Pennsylvania at the 1908 Games. The most important thing is not to win, but to take part. And certainly when I was growing up, this was much quoted, but I think one could have an interesting discussion now as to the extent to which it still applies. The pressure, not to say the financial rewards, of winning has increased with every Olympiad. The most controversial, indeed the most notorious games, were those held in Berlin in 1936. The venue of Berlin had been chosen before the Nazis came to power in Germany, but Hitler was in charge by the time the games took place, and he wanted to promote his Aryan policies and to ban participation by Jews. This led to great protests and also to a threat of boycotts, and so Hitler reluctantly relented and allowed Jews from other nations to participate, though a number of them did refuse. And the German team itself only contained one competitor of part Jewish descent, one Helen Meyer, a fencer who won a silver medal. Many teams were allowed or encouraged their athletes to give the Nazis salute, including, I'm sorry to say, the British but not the American teams. But here is Jesse Owens on the winner's podium after the long jump, giving a standard salute from the podium, no doubt as the American national anthem was played. Jesse Owens also ruined Hitler's ambition of using the games to demonstrate Aryan supremacy. He was the outstanding athlete of the games, winning 4 gold medals. In the modern era, the games have been held across the world on every continent so far, except America. Except Antarctica. No, except Africa. They haven't been held in Antarctica either, for that matter. Africa has not held the games yet. And of course, we are a few days from the start of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, here in towards the end of 2021. And we've got the symbol of the 2020 games and the various mascots. But the games, as I think you probably all know, have been delayed, not only delayed by a year, but will take place without spectators. And one really must sympathise very much, both with the organisers and with the athletes, at what they're having to put up with. And one very, very much hopes that the spectacle itself will not be downplayed as a result of the non-appearance of spectators. Over time, the number of sports in the games has increased hugely, as well as the participation, hooray, of women. Today, we have virtually equality between the sexes. Only Greco-Roman wrestling is restricted to men, but there are 2 sports, rhythmic gymnastics and synchronized swimming, which are in fact women only. So I'd like to move now to what I think has been the best Olympic Games of all to date, London 2012. Not best because the biggest. They're comparable in size both to the Beijing Games 2008 and to Rio in 2016, but probably the happiest. And here we see the Olympic Stadium at night and the logo for the 2012 Games. Now, you may think I'm a complete idiot, but it was only this year that I realized that that strangely shaped logo represented the numbers 2012 2012. I thought they were just some abstract symbol of the Olympics, but no, their 2012 is what they represent. And then the Olympic Games, sorry, the Olympic flame itself. The scale of the Games would have been completely unimaginable in 1896. It's the biggest spectacle of sport on earth, with almost as many countries competing as there were athletes in 1896. It can fairly be compared in importance and prestige to the original Olympic Games. The other numbers are extraordinary as well. Over 10,000 athletes with 302 events. And here are some of them. Athletics, of course. Equestrianism. Rhythmic gymnastics. This is one of the events which is restricted to women only. Boxing, which is both women and men. Cycling, traditional gymnastics, judo, and to say nothing of taekwondo, association football, lawn tennis, swimming, sailing, rowing, canoeing, shooting, archery, and the list just goes on and on. It's also interesting to look at some of the outstanding multi-gold medalists from modern Olympics. Michael Phelps of the USA in swimming, I think has got more gold medals than anybody in the whole history of the Games. Usain Bolt, who I mentioned earlier, from Jamaica, a sprinter, and Mo Farah, or I should call him Sir Mo Farah, from the UK, middle distance runner. They're all athletes who have won multiple events at more than one Games. And I think they can fairly be compared with the outstanding heroes of the ancient Olympics. And of course, though I haven't got time to go into detail, I must mention the Paralympic Games for athletes with disabilities. These began in Rome alongside the Olympics of 1960 and have also grown in prestige and size alongside the main Olympics in London. In London, 164 countries took part in the Paralympics with over 4,300 athletes, and the Games were every bit as competitive as the main Olympic Games. Unsurprisingly, therefore, they attracted large, enthusiastic crowds, and the standard of competition was high, and the skills and dedication of the Paralympians was evident to all. That large, unruly group on the left of this photograph is, in fact, my extended family. These were the only events I actually watched as I'd finished my job as a games maker and was free to actually attend and see some competition. It really was fantastic. But I want to return to the Olympics themselves, described by the IOC president, Jack Rogue, as the happy and glorious Games, which they certainly were. And he gave credit to the volunteers who assisted at every event and in any non-technical way necessary at the Games. And I was lucky enough to be one of them. As this slide shows, he said, the world would never forget the smiles, the kindness and the spirit of the wonderful volunteers, the much needed heroes of the Games. The idea of having a lot of volunteers, or games makers as we were known, followed the success of the Sydney Olympics in 2000, where the presence of volunteers was felt to have transformed those Games for visitors and competitors alike. The number of volunteers was really fantastic. 70,000 were chosen for London, all dressed in this distinctive uniform, old and young, unpaid, and doing a huge variety of tasks. They were known collectively as games makers. And here are some of the tasks they undertook. Crowd control, better than what happened at Wembley for the Euro finals 10 days or so ago. I just mentioned the drivers. One driver who I met was a senior British Airways pilot whose day job was flying Boeing 747s, but he'd been persuaded by his wife to take 2 weeks holiday. She was also a games maker, and he spent his time driving VIPs and competitors around London. The street in which I lived, there were two other games makers. One who looked after car parking at the rowing event, which was 15 miles away, and she had to get there every morning by 6 a.m. And the other was one whose job was to look after the athletes' changing room at the football venue, Wembley Stadium. But every games maker I met said that it was a truly great and happy experience, and it certainly was for me. We would not have missed it for the world. Helped too by the fact that the weather was lovely throughout the period of the Games, warm but not too hot, sunny and dry. I'll spend a moment talking about my own rather peculiar role. I was what was known as a dignitary's assistant, and I had the job of looking after the sports minister of Senegal, which is a country in West Africa, one of whose official languages is French, and I speak a little French. If you remember that the ancient Olympic Games, visiting VIPs were housed in a special building in the center of the Altis, the Leonidion. These days, they are put up at top hotels, and my dignitary or VIP, El Haji Malik Gaku, had a suite in the Savoy Hotel, one of the best hotels in London. My job each day was to find out what Mr. Gaku wanted to do or see, whether they wanted to go to the athletes' village and meet the Senegalese athletes, watch the Senegalese football team either in training or in competition, or to go and see some other Olympic competition. I then had to make sure that we had a car available for him and that the venue was expecting us, etc. When that was all arranged, I would set off for the Savoy to meet him and get the day going. In some ways, the journey into central London was the best bit. On the underground, everyone, visitors and Londoners alike, were smiling or laughing and even talking to complete strangers, something completely unheard of in the London Underground. And they were thrilled and intrigued to meet a games maker in this strange but distinctive uniform. Once in central London, I had half a mile walk to the hotel, and across London, the streets were a buzz of laughter and smiles. It was just extraordinary. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. They truly were the happy games. The one thing I did not see was any Olympic competition, except for part of 2 football matches involving Senegal, but it was enough to be there. I did, however, see some of the Paralympics with my family, but that was awesome in itself. But my favorite photograph of the Olympics themselves is this one, taken from a passageway leading towards the main arena, which was as close to the action as I can get. If the camera angle could only go round a corner, you would be looking at the precise moment when Usain Bolt won the 100 meters. So there he is, winning the 100 meters completely out of sight. But I did get a good view of much of the closing ceremony. Sorry, that switched too quickly. By getting myself in an area just behind the area reserved for wheelchair spectators. So I did see that. On the other hand, I only got a very partial view of the spectacular closing fireworks, as I had to wait in the car park behind the stadium to meet and escort a group of VIPs back to their coach to take them back to their hotels. But who cares? I didn't. So there it is, the story of the Games in a nutshell. If the Paris Games of 2024 or the Los Angeles Games of 2028 have volunteers on a large scale, and you have the opportunity to be one of them, I would say go for it. You won't regret it. So there we are. Now I'm going to hand over to Heather, who will read out your questions, which I will try and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Our first question comes from Jean in St. Louis, and she says, did any other Greek cities besides Olympia have any ties to the Games in 1776?
No, the ancient Olympic Games always took place only in Olympia, and that was part of the secret of their success. But the fact that, as I said, that the Greek city-states were at war with each other much of the time, and therefore you couldn't have competitions between athletes from the states if that was still going on. And so the competition took place at Olympia, and the state of Elis, which was the organizer for the Games, sent out these heralds across Greece and across the Mediterranean to ensure that there was a truce and that the athletes and the spectators could come safely to the Games, but they always took place at Olympia.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Nicholas in the United States, and he says, do you know why the Olympic Games only took place every 4 years? So what was significant about that 4-year period?
No, I don't. But if you think about the modern games, which are also on a 4-year cycle, it actually works quite well for sports people. They come up to a peak this year, or originally they were going last year. They do their best. Some of them will then retire. Others will then develop, and so it gives the athletes, I think, time to develop and time to move on. But I don't know any specific reason why 4 years. But I think it's a period that works basically.
Perfect, thank you. Owen in Kent says, how does a new sport get introduced to the Olympics?
In the original Olympics, I mean, in original Olympics, probably rather like today, there would be people who said, I mean, if you take chariot racing, for example, it started with 4-horse chariots, and quite a bit later, the 2-horse chariot race was introduced. And I would think that there were probably quite a number of people who had 2-horse chariots, and thought that they should be given the chance to compete, and they would have made representations of one sort or another. I mean, that's how sports are added or taken away from the Olympics today. Let's take the sport of, I think, badminton, which is not an Olympic sport. I know that the people involved with badminton are very, very keen that it should be, and they make representations to the International Olympic Committee, I think probably every time. But the Olympic Committee decides, whether it decides it fairly or not, I don't know, but they decide on the basis of how widespread is the sport, how popular is the sport. And when I say widespread, how many countries take part in the sport. I mean, take the example I gave of rope climbing. I don't think you'd find enough rope climbers around the world these days, and so it was dropped. On the other hand, things like BMX, bicycling, are very, very popular across the world. A lot of young people participate, and so that's been added to the games, while other things haven't. I mean, there were other sports. Polo was originally, or not originally, but was an early sport which was dropped. Tug of war with ropes was another sport which was dropped. And so it's a question of trying to decide which sports deserve a place in the games by the number of countries in which they're practiced and the number of practitioners.
Thank you. And linked to that, Lillian in Jacksonville, she says, thank you for your interesting lecture. I was wondering if there was any sport that you thought should be in the Olympics, which is not.
Well, my sport, or the one I did when I was a touch younger than I am now, was rugby football. And I'd love to see rugby football in the games, but the trouble is that although it's quite widely played, it isn't widely enough played. For example, the rugby union is in the Commonwealth Games because many countries in the Commonwealth play rugby. But if you take the world as a whole, I mean, there are whole swathes of the world where rugby is either unknown or is a complete minority sport. So it's not surprising it hasn't been accepted, but it is disappointing.
Thank you. Candida in Santa Monica says, can you comment at all on what it would have been like to be a spectator at the ancient games? Would spectators have needed to pay to attend, or could anyone come along and watch?
The truthful answer is I don't know, but I think I would be quite surprised if they had to pay. I would have thought that I would have thought anybody who turned up. I mean, if you go back to the pictures of the stadium, I mean, it was really open to everybody. So I think anybody who turned up could have done so. But it's an interesting question. I mean, since the stadium was said to hold 40,000 people, how do you house 40,000 people in a relatively rural area of Greece? It must have been quite a logistical problem, but I would be quite surprised. I've never heard that people had to pay. I'd be quite surprised if they did have to.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Bill in Windsor in Canada, and he says, many years ago we visited Olympia, and he says, I seem to recall a walk of shame where there are statues of cheetahs which Olympians must walk between on the way to the stadium as a means of discouraging such behaviour. Do you know about this as well?
It rings a small bell. I mean, I did mention that the walk to the stadium come from the Altius, goes along a passage. In fact, the publicity which Viking did for this talk shows the passage which goes from the Altius into the stadium with the arch at the end, and all the athletes would have gone down it. I confess I don't know that it was called the Walk of Shame, but I can see that it might have been. But that's how the athletes got from the Altius into the stadium. Obviously not the horse racing, but all the other events would have gone. The athletes would have gone that way.
Fantastic. Thank you. Our next question comes from James in Potlatch in the United States, and he says, would you please say something about the other non-Olympic games? Did they have the same events and the same rules and any of the same participants? Were there also the same prizes? Why did the Olympics become the main one?
I think the short answer is that there were a number, I can't remember how many, but there were, I mentioned the Pentathlon games, which took place in Athens. I mentioned the games for women, which took place at the Olympic Stadium under the protection of the goddess Hera. And there were certainly a number of others. I think they would all have had the same basic approach. Whether there were particular variations, I don't know. But this is how the athletes themselves kept themselves going, because we talked earlier about the 4-year interval between the games. If there was nothing else going on, just as today you have the Pan American Games, you have the Commonwealth Games, you have the European Athletic Games. So you do get other games going on, but I mean, just as now, none of these others have the status or the prestige of the Olympic Games. That was also the case back then. The Olympic Games were supreme. I mean, it's really quite astonishing to think that the Greek dating system, and of course they didn't know about AD or BC, because certainly when they were BC they couldn't have, but it is astonishing that the dating system was done in relation to the 13th Olympiad or the 26th Olympiad and the 3rd year of the 43rd Olympiad or whatever it is. And it does just show how important the games were in the mindset of the ancient Greeks at the time.
Thank you. Next question comes from Beth in Spearfish in the United States, and she says, can you tell us a bit more about how the Paralympics came to be introduced?
It's quite a long story, and it goes back to about 1948. I can't remember the precise year. There's a hospital in Buckinghamshire to the west of London, which specialised in dealing with people with particularly physical injuries, loss of legs, loss of limbs, inability to walk, etc. And the people there decided, the people who ran the hospital decided that it was quite a good idea to get their patients active physically, and they started a sort of informal games. And that got going, I think, in the late 1940s, and gradually developed, very much a British thing to begin with, and gradually developed from there and excited greater interest. And as I say, in 1960, the International Olympic Committee decided there were enough athletes from enough different countries to be worth having a parallel set of games. And so that's how that came into being. And I say, certainly by the time of London 2012, I think the figure was 130 countries taking part, over 4,000 athletes, and I can vouch for the fact that the standard of competition was quite extraordinary. And certainly watching it, once one had got immersed into the atmosphere of the games, you completely forgot that you were dealing with people with quite severe handicaps, except when you saw something like a one-legged high jumper. And I mean, one-legged high jumper could jump up 3 times as high as I ever could jump with both legs, and so you just are staggered by the skill, dedication, and ability, and they really do deserve to sit alongside the Olympic Games with good spectator participation.
Wonderful, thank you. Georgette in Cambridge says, I have so many great memories from watching London 2012. What are your most memorable or favourite moments?
Well, the most memorable moment was not seeing the final, not seeing the final of the 100 meters and Usain Bolt winning it. The other thing was that at the time in 2012, there was quite a lot of nervousness about whether the games could be the subject of some kind of terrorist attack. And I think that I didn't mention this at all in my talk, but I think the fact that the security arrangements were so efficient, they were not only were they efficient, but they were unobtrusive. And if you were going into a venue, as soon as you got in and you'd been through the security, you could relax. There was no worries at all that anything would happen. And in a curious way, that was it happened across the venues and across the games. And I mean, maybe a rather peculiar thing to say, but certainly it's one of my major memories of the games, was how relaxed one felt when one got into a venue through the security.
Wonderful, thank you. Caroline in Parkland in the United States says, a much debated question, but in your opinion, is there someone you would pick as a greatest Olympian of all time?
I'm not sure that I'm enough of an expert to do that, but certainly I think the three that I mentioned, Usain Bolt and the American swimmer whose name now escapes me, are really fantastic athletes. And I mean, what you realize when you see these people is not only have they got great natural ability, but they have really dedicated themselves to being outstandingly good. And so I think anybody at any level who is outstandingly good deserves praise and admiration.
Absolutely, thank you. Our next question comes from Wallace in Los Angeles, and he says, the Olympic opening ceremonies in recent times have become such incredible spectacles. Can you comment on when this element was added to the event and how it has become such an important part?
Yes, it's something I almost mentioned during the talk, because the idea of the Olympic flame being lit, because the Olympic flame today is lit in Olympia, and you can see the place where it is done, but I just didn't have time to, because it's a subject in itself, I didn't have time to go into that. But that was introduced in the 1936 games, the Berlin Games. That was where the idea of the Olympic torch and a torch relay before the games. And that, I think, was probably the start of turning the games into a spectacle. Just as I remember we talking about the ancient Olympic Games, there was the march down the sacred way from Elis to Olympia, which was obviously a fairly formal and important affair. And I think that the idea of the torch relay allowed this to develop. And so I think that the modern approach to the opening ceremony really dates from that. And if you think back, and I don't know how old you are, but like those opening ceremonies used to be, even in my memory, 30, 40 years ago, used to be just the athletes walking into the stadium, and gradually over time, not behind, but then the Olympic torch would come in as well. But over time, different national organizing committees decided that they wanted to do something really rather spectacular. And the first one I remember that was spectacular was actually the Winter Games in Grenoble in whatever year it was, 1980-ish, 1990, and the French put on a big show at the start of those games. And from then on, I think countries have competed not against each other, because each country is on its own, has really put a huge effort into making a spectacle of the opening ceremony.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Bishop Richard in Pompton Plains, and he says, in retrospect, what would you like to see changed or done differently in the modern games?
Well, I mentioned the motto which the Bishop of Pennsylvania introduced in 1908. The important thing, I won't quote it correctly, but the important thing is to take part and not to win, or ideas of that sort. And I think that I think we've probably moved quite a long way from that. There is honour in participating, undoubtedly, and that's why people have got no hope of winning take part in the games. But for the top athletes, the importance of winning has become so important, so preeminent, that I think it encourages all sorts of things, like the taking of drugs to enhance performance, etc. And one really, it's pie in the sky to think that one can eliminate that. But that, if you could wave a magic wand, I think that's the wand I would wave to make it effective in controlling performance enhancing drugs and medicines and what have you.
Absolutely, thank you. And a question from Greg in Chicago. He says, do you know if the London 2012 Olympics made or lost money?
It certainly didn't make money. It cost the British government a lot of money to hold those games. And that's true of all the games. I don't know. It's been true certainly ever since the Montreal Olympic Games of, 1968, I think, where the state of Montreal or of Ontario is still paying off the debt from those games. it costs the organisers a lot of money. And I don't know. I know that in the States there have been efforts to get big sponsorship to pay for a lot of the games, but I don't know how it's gone. I mean, Los Angeles will be the next one in 2028, the next one in the States, and I suspect that big efforts have been made to minimize the losses while not minimizing the spectacle.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that's all the questions we've had tonight, but I'll just finish by reading out a lovely comment. This is from one of our regular Viking.TV viewers, Miki in Montclair in the United States, and she says, "Thank you so much for this awesome lecture, David, especially the 2012 London where you volunteered. What an honour, and you still have your 2012 Olympic volunteer shirt in excellent condition. I think you now should frame it and hang it over your front door."
Well, thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed this evening, and I hope that I fulfilled my original intention, which was to tell you a bit more about something you knew a bit about, and that you found what I had to say interesting and occasionally slightly amusing. So thank you all very much indeed. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you all. Thank you. Goodbye.